Mental health workers of Reddit, what's the most fucked up thing you have seen? Don't work in the mental health profession, but I remember when I was in basic combat training there was a girl in my platoon who often just stared at us without blinking. She'd open her mouth to speak, but would just mumble. She'd sometimes say things about eyes being everywhere, watching her, and I think she refused to eat the food provided because she was paranoid. She had a weird speech pattern as well. And at night, when we were asleep in the female barracks, she was caught wandering around talking to herself and the supposed giant spiders she claimed to see crawling on the ceiling. Long story short, she was sent to the psych ward after having a mental breakdown that was triggered by the presence of the drill sergeants. She claimed they looked like demons. Come to find out, she was a paranoid schizophrenic, and they did not even catch that in her mental evaluation before shipping her to training. They did not even catch that in her mental evaluation. That's not surprising. A pre-military mental evaluation is essentially a short conversation with a doctor about if you've ever had any thoughts of violence or other mental issues. If you say no and have no prior medical proof, you pass. At least 2 people in boot camp with me were shipped home with mental issues. One threatened the drill instructors, the other slit his wrists. While working in a jail, I was called down to some own cell to assess him for homicidal ideations. When I got there, he had carved pieces of his legs out and stated he was a follower of Satan, whom told him he needed to release some spirits from his body. He had a long history of self-harm, including swallowing glass. He had a high threshold for pain. Jail was not a place he should have been at, but unfortunately mental health funding is one of the firsts to go when there are budget cuts. People like that are why we still need asylums. Obviously with better conditions than the old ones, but some people just need a fully supervised place to keep society and themselves safe from them. Mental hospitals totally still exist. They might be falling out of favor as a treatment option, but they are totally still an option. I had to have a talk about being sent to one when I was in college. Instead of going, I signed myself over to my boyfriend as my temporary guardian until we could find the right medication combo. And no, I don't remember how that worked. I worked in a psychiatric medical institute for children. One girl, 13, had been pimped out by her mother and abused by several men. One night at bedtime routines, she hadn't come out of the shower yet and had locked herself in. When she finally opened the door, she had bit into her hand, and her veins and tendons were showing. She kept moving her hand to watch them move. Craziest thing was that once she was transported to the hospital, her mother made jokes about how her daughter just wanted to see what it tasted like. This girl basically turned into a celebrity around the campus, because all the other children thought she was edgy for what she had done. Mother made jokes about how her daughter just wanted to see what it tasted like. How was the mother not in prison? That's disgusting. How was she not in prison for pimping out her kid? May have just been accusations with no actual evidence. I can't see any reality where that has happened, and she isn't in a cell. People are very fierce and protective when it comes to children. As a psychologist, I sometimes pick up hours at local clinics, weekends mostly. I specialize in children and family issues. A family came in randomly with their 5-year-old son. He had not spoken in a month. Not a word. A month ago, this poor child watched as his 6-year-old brother drowned in the family pool. The parents were unaware that both kids had gone outside. Unbelievable trauma. The 5-year-old had a 1,000-yard stare. Parents were crushed. Kids with an autism spectrum disorder are 160 times more likely to die from drowning, especially unattended in family-owned pools, compared with the general pediatric population. This is so sad. Poor kid, poor family. Wait, are you saying my inability to ever learn how to swim and my hydrophobia are related to having Asperger's? As someone who has no idea what she's talking about, it wouldn't surprise me, just because autism so frequently comes with sensory issues. Mental health is stigmatized enough without asking people to post horror stories for us to gawk at. I sincerely doubt you'll have many professionals willing to break a patient's confidence by sharing one of their worst moments for internet points. Please remember that people who are mentally ill are far more likely to be the victims of crime than the perpetrators. Thank you for saying this. So sad reading these comments of people who are obviously very vulnerable and in distress, and for the commenters to basically go look how weird they are. The worst is a response from an actual psychologist. People trust you. It's unethical to post stories about patients online without their consent. There's a time and a place for decompressing from and even joking about emotionally draining cases, and that's normally in a private, locked workroom with other professionals, and well out of earshot of patients, not on Reddit. Had a patient come into the emergency room. No shirt on, no shoes. He had this wild, manic look in his eyes. As I'm triaging him, he starts pacing back and forth, and tells me he was discharged from hour earlier. I ask him why, and he said it was because they couldn't find it. He came to the ER previously complaining of an insect burrowing into his brain. They did an MRI on him and he, of course, didn't have an insect in his brain. I walked him through his MRI results, calmly explained that he didn't have anything in his brain, and gently recommended that he speak to a psychiatrist. He decided to leave ER against medical advice. He came back an hour later via ambulance. He overdosed. His mom found him. Paramedics brought Ya to him, and we did a full code, but couldn't resuscitate him. He killed himself because no one believed him. Not a mental health worker, but have seen some things through my job. Watched a special needs girl punch our director for getting in her face. The girl was having a meltdown in our public facility. She was maybe mid-30s, and her caregiver was trying to calm her down. Our director walks up, gets in the girl's face, and proceeds to tell her she needs to leave without context of who this is and the situation. Next thing I know is this girl has grabbed our director by her shirt collar and is giving her a good old-fashioned beatdown. I called 911 and then called for staff help. By this time the punching was over. The caregiver was between the girl and director, and cops are rolling in from across the street. Girl never came back. Director retired the next year, keeping some things vague for a reason. To clarify, this was not a ward hospital of any kind. Had a Munchausen's case in the ICU a few months ago, woman in her mid-20s who had been intubated upwards of 40 times and hospitalized over 70 times in the past 3 years for anaphylactic reactions, even though there was never any physical evidence of anaphylaxis. She came up to our ICU after one of these episodes. We extubated her and told her there was no evidence that she had had an anaphylactic reaction, easy intubation, no swelling of the throat, etc. This upset her greatly, and she proceeded to have a pseudo-seizure and held her breath to make it seem like her oxygen saturation was dropping, all witnessed by the team. We attempted to involve psychosocial work, but she checked out against medical advice when we wouldn't give her the type and amount of an opioid she wanted. That just sounds like an addict. They can be pretty creative. I've been in inpatient psych wards multiple times. When I was a teenager, I didn't see any of this behavior. People with suicidal ideation, yes. People self-medicating with substance abuse issues, of course. Self-harm, yes. But everyone got along, and it honestly was a very therapeutic environment being around people who also suffered from similar issues and could relate. Even just spending an hour in a psychiatric care facility visiting my sister, I witnessed a very violent individual lashing out. The staff had him alone and in his room, but I could hear him screaming and trying to break things from across the hall and through 2 armored doors. In my own time in a psych ward, I didn't see much either. But it happens, whether we see it or not. Then you were in a good facility. I've heard horror stories from the ward my mother was in. It may sound funny at the beginning, but it isn't. Not me, but my flatmate. He was in psychiatry rotation, last year of medical school. Single mom patient in her early 30s. She was really obsessed with a famous singer and claimed that everything she does was to make him happy or to make him notice her. This was not as problematic when it started, just looked funny seeing an adult woman behaving as a 14-year-old. But it got worse, and she started forgetting about important stuff, like that she had to take care of her daughter. Won't get into details there, but it never got better, and she ended up losing custody. I don't know what happened to the kid, but the father abandoned way before she was born. I hope that both the kid and the mother are better now. Barely related to Op's question, but I just finished reading my grandfather's memoir. He wrote about his time spent during the D-Day invasion of Normandy. It wasn't until he developed Alzheimer's in his 70s that he stopped having PTSD nightmares, and it was the Alzheimer's that ended them. kind of interesting and sad at the same time. Sometimes diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia actually end up sending the patient back to a happier time in their lives, so they're happy in their own little world. But it's tough for loved ones to watch. Absolutely. I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy to go through as a victim or a relative, but when he died peacefully. It's a terrifying but fascinating disease. I started working in the field when we began to empty out the state hospitals. One of my jobs working at a community mental health center was to be a liaison between the state hospital and the local nursing homes, which basically became where many of the severely mentally ill ended up. One of the cases that bothered me the most was an elderly deaf woman who had been at the state hospital since she was a child. She had been admitted to the facility simply because she was deaf. She had never had a mental illness, but over the decades, had developed institutionalized behavior to the point that she could not function in the community. Now she was being forced from the state hospital, where she had been all her life, into a nursing home facility. It was tragic on so many levels. Not a worker, I was a patient in a facility. As expected, everything was made so we wouldn't be able to hurt ourselves. One day another patient was able to hide one of the plastic utensils we used to eat. They counted them before we threw our plates away, so IDK how she did it. While we were all in the common room, she stabbed herself in the neck with it after sharpening it, and she was just pouring blood. Nurses were on it quickly and she was rushed out. We were sent to our rooms as they cleaned up. We were given an extra night snack later though. If you don't mind me asking, what were you in for? Sorry if this offends you, I just like context. You don't have to reply. ODW lol, I don't mind. It was a suicide attempt, most of us in there were there for that. Having to restrain someone to stop them from killing themselves is not something I want to experience ever again. One patient in particular was utterly determined to do it. The way she fought against us and screamed when we stopped her, you'd think we were torturing her. I mean, from her point of view, we definitely were. We were stopping something she was convinced was the most important thing she had to do. It wasn't that she thought her life was worthless, or that she was suffering so much she thought only death could free her. It was a fixed idea. Something she could not stop thinking about. I only worked at that place for a few months, but I had to stop her from hurting herself a number of times, and it's just bone chilling to see how utterly determined she was.